Welcome and good afternoon or good morning, and thank you for joining us today on the implications of generative AI on legal education, a conversation with Dean Andrew Perlman. Today's fireside chat is going to be all about the implications for generative AI on legal education. It's a conversation with Andrew Perlman, and it's going to be a production from the Presidential Task Force on Law and Artificial Intelligence. The views of our speakers today may not represent those of the ABA and have not been pre-approved by the House of Delegates or the Board of Governors. For a few housekeeping issues, we will have the question and answer function turned on today. Please feel free to post any questions in the chats. Questions may be answered live if time allows, and if not, we may provide some additional material after the recording of this is added to the task force website that answers some of those questions for you. Hosting today's conversation is the Vice Chair of the Task Force on Law and Artificial Intelligence, Cynthia Cwik. Cynthia is a partner for 20 years with Jones Day and Latham Watkins, where she represented clients in high-profile matters involving complex science and technology issues. Cynthia has also been a fellow with Stanford University's Distinguished Career Institute program, where she focused on cutting-edge technology, including AI, and as the former chair of the ABA section in science, and is the former chair of the ABA section of Science and Technology Law. She's also the co-author of American Association of Advancement of the Science Report, Artificial Intelligence, Trustworthiness, and Litigation in 2022. Cynthia, welcome.
Thank you so much, Joey, and welcome everyone to this program. It's my great pleasure to introduce our very distinguished guest for you here today, Dean Andy Perlman. He's the Dean and Professor of Law at Suffolk University Law School. He's a nationally recognized voice on the future of legal education and law practice. And I'm very pleased that he is a member of our ABA Presidential Task Force on the Law and AI. He's previously served as the inaugural chair of the Governing Council on the Future of Legal Services, and he also has been the chief reporter of the ABA Commission on Ethics 2020, which was responsible for updating the ABA model rules of professional conduct to reflect changes in technology and increased globalization. His service as dean also has focused on national and local reform efforts ranging from police practices and access to justice to developing alternative paths to law schools and bar admissions. His legal scholarship has included numerous articles on professional responsibility and legal innovation, and they've appeared in some of the nation's leading law reviews. Of particular note, he's written about the implications of generative AI for legal services, and he actually recently co-authored an academic paper using ChatGPT. Welcome, Professor Dean Perlman.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's a pleasure to join you. And thanks to Joey and the task force for hosting this session.
Sure. You recently wrote an article entitled "The Implications of ChatGPT for Legal Services and Society." And in that article, you wrote, "For the legal industry, ChatGPT may portend an even more momentous shift than the advent of the internet." So that's quite a statement there. And my first question to you involves you're thinking about this, about the role AI will play in the delivery of legal services in the future. And I understand you've prepared a short demonstration to share with us on this.
I have, and I'd be delighted to share with you why I think generative AI is going to be so impactful. And as I said in that paper, I think more important not only than the internet, but perhaps any other technology that has come before it. And I have about 5 minutes worth of content really to make this point. One important overarching idea is just how rapidly generative AI is advancing in terms of its sophistication. And here are a couple of law-related ways in which it is already getting more sophisticated. So when we look back a year ago, when ChatGPT was first released, and that version of ChatGPT was called 3.5, version 3.5, it failed the bar exam, and it was applied to the LSAT and received an LSAT score of 149, which is in the bottom 40th percentile. Not especially impressive. But just a few months later, in March of this year, when GPT-4 was released, its performance on the bar exam was such that it would have passed the exam in every U.S. jurisdiction, and it also received an LSAT score of 163, which is in the 88th percentile. So you can see just how much it advanced in terms of its ability to think through law-related issues. And the reason that it's able to do that is that I think it's doing a lot more than simply predicting the next word in a sequence. Although technically that's what it's doing. The reality is that it's able to make connections between concepts and words that are pretty remarkable. And I'm going to give you two non-law examples just to emphasize this point of what it's able to do to make the kinds of connections that, frankly, we as lawyers are regularly requested and need to do. So here's one based on a photograph that my wife took during a recent visit to Las Vegas. And you can tell it's recent because you can see that sphere in the background that was recently constructed. And not surprisingly, when I asked ChatGPT, where do you think this picture was taken, it properly recognizes Las Vegas. But what was really remarkable to me was the next question that I asked. I said, what's your best guess based on the perspective of the photograph about where the photo was taken? And you can see it says based on the perspective, the height, the distance, it thinks that it was probably taken at one of two hotels, either the Cosmopolitan or the Bellagio. And my wife was staying at the Cosmopolitan. And so it was really remarkable that it was able to piece together those sources of information to reach that conclusion. Here's another one, a personal photograph I recently took of my daughter who was performing in a play on her college campus. I took the picture, I uploaded it to ChatGPT, and I asked, what do you think's going on in this picture? And I thought rather remarkably, it was able to figure out that this was probably part of a performance based on, it could see that it was probably a wig that both of these people were wearing, and the way in which they were posed and the background suggests that it was a play, which by itself I thought was pretty remarkable. But then the next question, really, the answer to it blew my mind. I said, well, any guesses as to what play this might be? And you can see it guessed, it thought Arsenic and Old Lace based on the setting, the characters, and that's exactly the play that my daughter was in. So these are just very simple examples of how sophisticated the logic is that's going on behind the scenes. So yes, it's a prediction engine for words, but in a much more sophisticated way than I think many of us give it credit for. So what does this mean for lawyers? And why did I write that sentence, Cynthia, that you described, is that it's already able to do some remarkable law-related work. So here's an example from litigation. About a year ago, a little less than a year ago, I was giving a presentation to a group in Philadelphia. It was after a snowstorm. And so I said, draft a complaint based on a slip and fall in Philadelphia where somebody is seeking damages because the homeowner failed to clean up the sidewalk after the snowstorm. And so ChatGPT goes to work, and I've sped up the video here. It doesn't normally do it this quickly, but it creates a caption, identifies the court of common pleas, which is right, and then goes through and gives some fairly boilerplate allegations. But what struck me was paragraph 6. It inserted Philadelphia Code section 10720. I looked it up, and it turns out that that code provision imposes on homeowners the duty to keep their sidewalks clear within a certain period of time after a snowstorm. ChatGPT then identifies negligence as the appropriate cause of action and even demands a jury trial at the end. I then asked it to draft some interrogatories from the defendant to the plaintiff in this case, and it does a pretty good job, the kind of interrogatories you might expect that a personal injury lawyer might use when defending the case. But what got my attention here was interrogatory number 4, which is not a boilerplate interrogatory. It says, please describe the footwear you were wearing. Very good question, because you would want to know that somebody's out in a snowstorm, what they're wearing on their feet. Did they take proper care? And in a comparative negligence state, that might be relevant. And then finally, I asked it to draft a brief in support of a motion to dismiss the very complaint that it had drafted. In other words, I asked it to attack its own work. And it gave me 3 arguments in support of the motion to dismiss. Now, are these arguments that I would just cut and paste into a brief? Of course not. That's absolutely not the point. Are they the best arguments possible? No. Are they even decent arguments? Not necessarily. The point is that I think we are going to be at a point before too long where lawyers, at least in a first draft, are using these tools to generate documents. And I'll end with a transactional example where I asked Bing, which is based on the same underlying technology, to draft a corporate merger agreement between a US and a Korean company. And I asked it to include, and prompt engineering is its own new skill, which we could talk a little bit about when we get to legal education, that the agreement should contain the usual terms and conditions of such an agreement. And boy, did Bing take that seriously, giving me lots of terms and conditions, many of which, this is not my area, but many of which look like the kinds of terms you would expect to see in an agreement of this sort. And it goes on and on. At various points, I had to prompt it to continue because I could tell it wasn't done. And so it is pretty thorough. Once again, you should absolutely not rely on this without checking every single word carefully. The overarching observation here is just how thorough these tools can be when properly prompted and trained. And of course, at the very end, once it finished up giving me this long document, I asked it to translate it into Korean, which it did fairly easily. So I'll stop there, and it's a long answer to your original question, but I think it makes the point that I raised in that article, which is that I think this is going to be a pretty transformative technology for the legal profession.
No, that's very impressive. Thank you so much for giving us that demonstration on Dean Perlman. So what does this mean for legal education, though? How is generative AI impacting law schools now, and how will it in the future?
I think every law school really needs to take seriously what kinds of skills they are going to impart to their students. And I think there are 2 possible paths, and I think law schools are going to need to pursue them simultaneously. The first is that I think law schools are going to have to double down on what you might call the bespoke skills of lawyering. That is, the problem solving, the judgment, the human-to-human interactions that are so critical to great lawyering. That is not going to disappear, and those are some of the skills that will be disrupted if ever, then in the long distance future in terms of this technology. So I think law schools really need to double down on teaching those skills. But at the same time, I firmly believe that law schools are also going to have to teach students how to embrace these tools, how to use them to deliver legal services effectively, because I think before too long, the expectation is going to be that every lawyer is going to be able to generate information and documents using these tools, that it will become as routine and as necessary as using online legal research tools to conduct legal research, as opposed to only using physical sources that you find in the library. So I think that law schools are going to have to do both. And at the end of the day, the reason that I think both are going to be necessary is that I don't think, as many people have said, it's not going to be a battle between lawyers and generative AI. What I believe, and what others have said as well, is that what the future is going to be is lawyers who know how to use generative AI effectively versus lawyers who don't. And I think law schools have an obligation to make sure that their students fall in the first camp and not the second.
So what do you think law schools need to do to teach these new delivery models? And what are you doing at your law school?
So I think what law schools need to do at the most conceptual level is teach what you might call a new kind of issue spotting. So when we were in law school, you probably recall having been taught a lot of different doctrinal areas: contracts, property, constitutional law, torts. And the idea is, one of the ideas of learning that material is that you can spot those issues when you get out into practice. You're not necessarily going to remember all of the doctrines and all of the elements of each issue that you learned about, but you want to be able to spot those kinds of issues when you're out in practice so that you can look into them and see the connections that between what a client might be telling you and some legal issues that might be embedded. What I think law schools will need to be able to do is teach students how to spot the issue of how to deliver a particular legal service better, faster, and cheaper using available technology. So if you introduce students to generative AI, to automated document assembly, to legal project management, legal process improvement, the point is that they won't remember necessarily how to use the type of technology that was available in 2023. What you want them to be able to do is that when they get into practice and they are delivering a service in any area, they can say, you know what, the way we're going about it at our firm and our legal department, our legal services organization, there is a better, faster, or cheaper way to deliver that service. And the reason I know that is I was exposed to those core concepts when I was in law school. And then they can look at what's available at that particular point in time in terms of the technology and better serve their clients and better serve their employers. So I think that's what law schools at the end of the day need to be able to do, is teach that kind of new issue spotting to their students.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing at Suffolk Law School?
Yes. So about a decade ago, we launched the nation's first legal innovation and technology concentration, which is kind of like a law school major in legal innovation and technology. And the idea was to teach students the very kinds of skills that I just described in terms of a new kind of issue spotting. So a lot of people, I think, get confused when they hear about legal technology, and I think it's about intellectual property or the law of technology more generally, and it's not. The best description that I've heard is from Mark Lauritsen, who introduced me to this idea that what we're teaching in these courses and that what we're talking about today is not the law of technology. We are talking about the technology of law, the technology of law practice, the technology of legal services delivery. And that's what that concentration was all about a decade ago, is the technology of law practice, the innovation of law practice. How do you reimagine a particular legal service to better serve your clients? So we introduce students through that concentration to subject areas like automated legal document assembly. So you might call it the turbotaxing of legal forms. How do you do it? It's actually you have to be pretty knowledgeable substantively to be able to do that effectively. We introduce them to legal project management, process improvement, design thinking for lawyers, a whole array of different and new concepts that traditionally have not been taught in law schools. And we started to do that a decade ago, and we could talk a little bit more about some of the career outcomes for the students who started on that path early, because they've been really remarkable. And then since then, we have developed an Institute for Legal Innovation and Technology. Under that umbrella is a pioneering legal innovation and technology lab. The LIT Lab is what you might think of as a new kind of clinic, where the client might be an organizational client like a court or a legal services organization, and we're helping them reimagine their work so that they can better serve the public. So, for example, we've had a partnership now with the Massachusetts courts, where we've helped to automate a number of commonly used legal forms to make access to justice a little bit more, justice a little more accessible in the Commonwealth here. And our students are involved in building those solutions. So it's giving them hands-on experience to take what they're learning in the classroom and apply it to a real world setting. And I'll give you one final example of a program that we've developed, which I think is kind of neat, is our traditional clinics, whether it's an immigration clinic, criminal defense clinic, prosecutor clinic. We have what are called legal innovation and technology fellows, who are students specially trained in all of the skills that I was just describing. They're embedded in the clinic, and they're helping that clinic, that traditional clinic, reimagine some aspect of their work so that they can better serve their clients through innovation and technology. So we've really taken a somewhat more comprehensive approach not relied on any particular solution. And I think that type of thinking, that methodology to legal education is going to become even more important in the years ahead. So those are a few examples.
No, thanks for that. And based on your conversations with professors and deans at other law schools, what do you think is going on at other law schools? Is this a topic that is of great concern to other law schools too, making sure that they're being able to create the right course offerings and all regarding these changes?
Absolutely. There have been an increasing number of law schools that are really emphasizing legal innovation and technology. So I don't want to suggest in any way that Suffolk is the only one, just happens to be the one I know well.
Sure.
But there are a lot of law schools that are doing this kind of work, and I think they're serving their students well by doing it. So yes, I know it is front and center for many deans, and it became especially so since ChatGPT's release. There's been a lot more conversation around the importance of this new way of thinking since ChatGPT was released a year ago.
And how about existing lawyers? What do you think lawyers who are already in practice need to do to become educated about these new technologies?
I think they need to try them. Now, you have to try them carefully. We could talk about the legal ethics issues, but learn how to use it, just as lawyers had to learn how to use online legal research tools when they were in law school, have had to go to the library and look at pocket parts when shepherdizing, right? They had to learn a new skill, a new way of doing things. Or people who learned how to write memos and briefs longhand or on a typewriter suddenly had to learn word processing. So I think this is not new. Or another example, and this very much relates to me, when I was in practice and as a litigator, I had to go page by physical page in discovery to look for what was relevant, privileged, subject to the work product doctrine. And then e-discovery came along. So there's nothing new about the idea of existing lawyers having to retool, learn a new technology to better serve their clients. I think this is another one of those moments. I think lawyers need to understand the capabilities of ChatGPT and generative AI more generally, what it can do, just as importantly as what it can't do. I think you need to have a good sense of both. There are lots of ways for lawyers to learn it. The other approach, which I think is quite important and a benefit to law students who may be listening to this or new lawyers, is that I think law firms and legal departments are going to be increasingly interested in hiring newly licensed lawyers who have this skill set. Because if you're an existing lawyer and you don't feel entirely comfortable using these tools, the next best thing is hire people who are. And I think this is a great opportunity for law students because it flips the traditional training model on its head. If you think about it in these terms, a law firm like we used to work, you bring a new law graduate on board and you invest a lot of time in training them, helping them to learn what it takes to be a lawyer at your firm. That's still going to be important, but wouldn't it be really valuable for a law firm if the learning went the other way as well? If, as these law firms are trying to figure out generative AI and how to use it in the delivery of legal services, they can hire somebody who's already had that experience. So I think this is really an enormous potential for law students and future lawyers as well.
Terrific. How about the admissions process for law schools? There's been some discussion about whether law schools should allow potential students to use generative AI and AI tools in the application process. What's your thoughts on that?
This is a really interesting subject, and views on it vary widely. There are some schools that have announced that applicants cannot use generative AI. And I get it because you think, well, I want to see how how people present themselves and their capability to write on their own. And generative AI is going to distort one's ability to interpret how skilled they are in that area. But there is another view, and I actually myself fall into this camp, that we should allow it. And the reason is twofold. Number one, I think that there are enormous inequities that are built into the existing application process because applicants who have access to family members or college pre-law counselors who will look over their applications, give them feedback, even some line edits, are at an enormous advantage over applicants who do not have access to those resources. And if generative AI can help to level the playing field, I'm all in favor of it. So that's reason number one, that I am not opposed to lost applicants being able to use these tools. The second reason is that these are the tools of the future. And you are forever and throughout your career now going to have to make your best case possible in writing and otherwise in collaboration with these tools. So it would be a little bit like asking applicants to submit their applications with handwriting instead of using word processing. These are just state-of-the-art tools. They're table stakes. And I think before too long, within the next few years, it's going to become so a matter of course to use these tools where we're not going to think twice about them. So for those two reasons, I tend to put myself in the latter camp and think applicants should be allowed to use these tools. But I can understand the difference of opinion as well.
Can you talk for a minute about lawyers' ethical obligations and how they may be impacted by generative AI?
Yeah, I think there are a number of rules of professional conduct that are implicated by generative AI. On the whole, I believe that the rules of professional conduct hold up pretty well and can be used to navigate the issues. There are a few that I'll mention. Rule 1.6, the duty of confidentiality, the Ethics 2020 Commission that you mentioned that I was involved in about a dozen years ago, revised the rule and added a new section to emphasize that lawyers have to take reasonable precautions when it comes to protecting client information. And that is true when using generative AI. You have to read the terms and conditions. And the reality is that certainly the free version of, just use ChatGPT as the example, that's not confidential, nor is actually the premium version that you can purchase. Only the enterprise version actually hives off your data. So you have to be very careful about putting anything sensitive or confidential in these tools. So that's one rule that's implicated. Rule 5.3 and the duty of supervising outside non-lawyer assistance. And that last word is not ANTS, but it was changed to ANCE, assistance, because of the idea that we're often using third-party tools. And I think there are a number of factors there that lawyers would need to consult. I don't think there are a barrier to using generative AI, but rather some guideposts for doing so. And then the last one I'll mention is Rule 1.1, Comment 8, which was added by the Ethics 2020 Commission, recognizing that prior to that point, the word technology did not appear at all in the model rules of professional conduct. And when we were discussing where the word technology should appear, we decided that it really should appear in Rule 1.1, which is the duty of competence. And we added the thought that lawyers have a duty to stay abreast of changes in the law and its practice, including the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. And I think that's very true here, is making yourself aware of the benefits and risks associated with generative AI. And I'll maybe close on this point, which is that when it comes to the duty of competence and being careful about using generative AI, and we certainly have to be, and I don't want to understate how important it is to check every word for accuracy, for making sure citations are accurate. And it's just a collaboration partner. It should never be something that lawyers are just cutting and pasting from. But I think we're going to go from that point to, in the not too distant future, having the duty of competence require us to use these tools in much the same way that jurisdictions now require us to have an email address. It wasn't so long ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when bar associations were raising ethical concerns about lawyers using email. And now it's an ethical requirement. I think generative AI is going to go through a similar evolution. We're raising appropriate concerns about the use of it now, but before too long, we will be expected to use these tools. The idea of opening up a blank screen and starting to write is going to go like the way of the typewriter.
No, thank you. That's so insightful and important for everyone to hear. We're at time, but we do have one question. So perhaps you can answer this quickly. Stephen Chow asked, I think, a very interesting question, saying that in the past at Columbia Law School, they identified the American JD training is involving, one, spotting the issues, and two, framing the issues. And he's taught since then the lost art of office memoranda involving interactive framing, to find what question and available answers advance the client's interests. It seems like generative AI is still some way away from that, but how far? Do you have any opinion on that?
I think we're still a distance away from general artificial or generative AI being able to do this. But that doesn't mean it can't help in that exercise. That if you give it, and I've done this, I've used old exam questions of mine, put it into GPT-4, and it's pretty good at identifying legal issues and giving the beginnings of a decent legal analysis. So although I don't think it can replicate the best law firm associates right now, I do think it can be helpful in engaging in that kind of analysis. And so maybe a different way to put the point is that I think the way in which we thought through issues, which oftentimes was in the form of a memo, I think we're probably going to go about that sort of work of issue spotting and issue analysis in a different way in the future. Not necessarily a better way. It will be a different way. And I'll just mention one in our legal research and writing course at Suffolk this year that our professors are incorporating. It's a ChatGPT revision exercise. Students who have learned about a particular legal issue then have to generate a memo, kind of what it was embedded in that question, write a memo, and then analyze the memo and determine what was good about ChatGPT's response and where did it fail, and then rewrite it. So revising it. So I think it's going to be an iterative exercise in the future. Again, coming back to the point I made before, it's not going to be creating something from scratch. You're going to have this exchange instead of maybe with a partner in the first instance, at least in the first instance with a Gen AI tool. And that is where we're going to go, I think, before too long.
Fascinating. No, thank you for those wonderful insights. I'm sorry that we're at the end of our time. We could keep going discussing this for a very long time, but we're very appreciative of you making the time to come and talk with us for a few minutes about these very important topics.
My pleasure, Cynthia. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. 30 minutes really flies by when you're having such a fascinating conversation. I want to give a big thank you to Dean Perlman and Cynthia Cwik for putting this event together and for bringing us such a fantastic conversation. Mark your calendars because there will be 2 additional events in January from the AI Task Force. On January 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be hosting an event entitled How Large Law Firms Are Implementing AI into Practice. It's going to be an excellent panel conversation for an hour. And then on January 11th, Cynthia will be hosting another fireside chat entitled AI Governance, a conversation with Miriam Vogel, who is the chair of the National AI Advisory Committee. We hope you can join us for both those events. As a reminder, today's event should be available online early next week on the AI Task Force website, as well as some written answers to any unanswered questions that we weren't able to provide today. We thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.